Resume recording. All right, Jason, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Cassandra, and thank you for the last minute opportunity to come and do a quick little infomercial on our grant. Hi, everyone. I look quickly looking at the names on here, and I see a few folks that I know. So hey to folks I know, and nice to meet the folks I haven't met. So real quickly here, for those of you who don't know First Five, we are an organization that serves children aged 0 to 5 and their families, and every county has a First Five. We are a tobacco tax funded program, and largely what we do is try to, in our county anyway, we do a lot of advocacy, we do a lot of convening of organizations and discussions, and we also do a lot of funding. In some ways, we're not unsimilar to the Community Foundation. There's a lot of things that we do in a lot of areas that we find that we're a good pair for each other. In fact, this year we worked real closely with the Community Foundation around their disaster relief fund during all of COVID, I should say, the previous year in 2020 and part of 21. So that's just a very, very brief background, because I know you guys have a lot of other stuff on the agenda. What I am here today to let you know about is this request for proposals, an RFP that we actually released now about a week and a half, 2 weeks ago. And I know this is a little bit late to be showing up to this meeting, but we were just trying to cover all our bases to see if there was any other opportunity for organizations that hadn't heard of us or hadn't heard about the grant. We tried to push our email blast out pretty far and wide, and we know those get circulated, and probably some of you received 2 or 3 versions of that. But I'll give you kind of a brief rundown of what you see on the slide here, and maybe annotate or fill in just a little bit about what we were hoping to have. So as I said, we're largely a funder, and we don't release kind of middle of the year funding a lot. This is one situation where last year was a little bit weird with COVID, so we did some COVID supported kind of granting. This year, we were looking at some of the funds that we had dedicated in our current strategic plan, which is a 4-year strategic plan. And one or several of our commissioners had made the idea, had said, we really want this next round of funding. And ultimately, by the way, our commission is who decides or where our funding goes. I am staff to the commission, as is our executive director, Wendy Wendt. So we can make recommendations, but we're not the ones who decide everything. But they said, how about instead of several smaller grants, and by smaller, First Five, I'd say we do a fair amount of, $50,000 to $150,000-ish $1,000 grants. And they said, why don't we focus more on, one big idea? And so we kind of went with that, with their recommendation to focus on putting an RFP out to the community of programs that largely serve or have a history of supporting families with children aged 0 to 5, to work on, create something new or expand something that serves children aged 0 to 5. I know I keep repeating that, but that's really the important part about First Five, because if you don't serve children 0 to 5, probably this grant isn't for you. So that's a big thing. Even though there's some bit of wiggle room, gray area sometimes when you serve more than children aged 0 to 5, but you have to make sure that that's part of your deal. So before I go any further, I want to say that the entire grant, since this is just a quick, brief overview, is on our website at first5slow.org, and you can /grants. I think I don't know, Cassandra, if you're able to type in the link into the chat, that would be great. And we have 3 focus areas in our current strategic plan, and that's sort of, besides 0 to 5, the response or the proposal needs to focus on one of those 3 areas. So either child health and development, early learning and resilient families. And we know that sometimes some of you have programs that probably cross one or more or all three of those focus areas for us. And that's okay. If you're thinking that you might be applying for this, you could say all three, or you could pick one. It's okay. Like, don't let that be a hang up. Just make sure that what you're applying for fits under one of the three for sure. As I mentioned, we said in our RFP that we were looking for one or two big ideas. A lot of times what happens when First Five does this granting is we say, we're doing one RFP and it's for this amount of money, and we're going to award one fund. And we get these great responses that come in, and we find that it's not just that it's hard to decide who should get the funding, it's that we see such an opportunity if we're able to partially fund both. In this situation, $900,000 is the total amount. And so if we do more than one, and there is a possibility we could fund more than one, there's not another 900,000. So the 900,000 would have to start being divided up depending on what the requests were. And so I think primarily we're hoping to look at, boy, one amazing idea that's really going to take a deep dive into continued support for children aged 0 to 5. But we're also open to the idea that there might be two other mid-range applications that we could see supporting. And particularly if they go together, or if they fit such a need in the community, that it would be a shame to miss the opportunity of funding them. I will mention that we're looking at that the commission, as we move forward and we're now 20 plus years of First Five, we used to fund things 100%. Boy, we would buy a preschool, or we would not buy a preschool, but we funded a preschool entirely, or we'd fund, a lactation support program entirely. And our funding from the state, from tobacco tax revenue, has been going down because, in a good way, people are smoking less. So that's a good thing. But it means less funding. And so we have to make sure we're looking at sustainable programs, braided or blended programs, where we're not the only funder, and that we are working where we're investing in programs, perhaps programs that have an established history, and a grant like this is an opportunity to expand it or make it different, or perhaps better somehow, to increase capacity somehow. So if with a 25% match on this and at a $900,000 price, it probably does, start to eliminate some of the smaller nonprofits that might apply for it. But there's always opportunity for collaboration. It doesn't have to be, there could be one lead agency and several partners. So we're open to looking at all kinds of ideas. I don't want anyone to feel like because they're small, they shouldn't apply. However, if $900,000 is 50% of your overall grant, then I would say probably we'd want to make sure you've got some partners in there. This is a 3-year grant, and roughly 3 years. It goes out to June 24. I know we're already into 21 a bit, so fiscal year 21, 22. So the 900,000 we thought about when we initially released this to say we were going to say it's 300 annual, and we decided that the programs agencies that would be applying, you all know your budgets better, and oftentimes there's startup costs where there's more expenses right at the beginning, and then it might taper towards the end. Or you have different needs in different years, depending on what the program is. So we're leaving that up, but we said in lump sum is 900. It could be less. So there is a section in the grant where we're saying, if you were offered less money, how might you scale this idea to go if you needed to scale it back a little bit? And boy, I know that was a lot really quickly. the letters of intent, I'm sorry, are due on Monday, and those are required. And but if you were really interested, I promise you the letter of intent. If you get a letter of intent in, you would qualify to submit your entire proposal. So we're not going to be scoring the letters of intent. And the proposals will be due September 10th, and those will be reviewed and discussed and scored by a committee of folks. And then we would make recommendations to the commission about which ones should move, or which one, or perhaps more than one, would be funded for a contract. All right. That was a lot in a very short amount of time. Are there any questions about our first 5 Thrive requests for proposals? This idea that it's a big idea, something where it's an opportunity for a program or an agency to go deep and take a big swing. All right. Sandra, am I missing anything?
No, thank you so much for joining us, Jason.
Okay. All right. If anybody has any questions, feel free to email me. My email is jwells, that's JWELLS at first, FIRST 5, the numeral 5, SLO.org. And thanks everyone. Thanks, Cassandra.
Thank you, Jason.
Bye.
Bye. Okay, so we'll go back to our regularly scheduled program now. This just was a tremendous opportunity, so I just wanted to make sure it was on everybody's radars, especially since the deadline's right around the corner. So hello, I'm Cassandra. I'm the Director of Grants and Programs, and I joined the foundation about 1.5 years ago. And I love working with nonprofits. A couple of different ways that we can collaborate together is through our grant making. So if you have questions about the grant application, feel free to reach out to me via email. But I also like to think of myself as a thinking partner. So if you're in your office and you're really chewing on something and you're trying to reach to a conclusion and need a thought partner, I like to make myself available to be that for you. And I can also help too, and what I hope to do with what I share today in providing you with information that will also be helpful not only for our applications, but other applications that you might be applying to as well. So today we have quite a media agenda. So we'll go ahead and launch into the fall grant program, and then I'll share with you again tips to submit a successful application. I'll go through our online application. There's been a couple of modifications that happened this year that should really ease the application process that I'm excited to talk about. Then I'll also discuss our upcoming year calendar. If you've been working with the foundation in the past, you'll know that last fall we launched our spring grants about 1.5 months early because we wanted to get as much funding out the door as possible as soon as possible. So we took a fresh look at what our grant calendar will be for next year, and I'll share that with all of you so you can have those dates well in advance. And then we'll also have question and answer. Before I launch in though, my hope is that this isn't the next hour of me jibber jabbering and feeding you information. My hope is that you feel free to ask questions and interrupt. My only ask is that if you do ask a question, try and keep it really broad, so that way everybody can benefit from the question that you're asking instead of it being super program specific. And if you do have a program specific question, please feel free to email me and we can set up a time to chat. Right now I'm working a hybrid calendar, and so voicemails get forwarded to my email. So it's just easier to reach out to me via email to schedule those types of things. My hope is that I'll be in the office more soon. We just have a bit of a construction project going on. So email is the best way to reach me. So This is always an exciting and fun workshop to host. There's some of you that have had a very long history of working with the foundation, whereas others of you, this might be your first introduction to the foundation. So I try and strike a balance so that way everybody can learn from each one of the slides. But the Community Foundation was created in 1998 by a group of wonderful community leaders that really had a vision for the community of being able to support the community in a really dynamic way. So in the late 90s, there was this movement throughout the state of California to develop community foundations with the idea that we wanted money to stay local, and a lot of estate planning would have funds go to large entities such as Fidelity and different things like that. And so the money wasn't staying necessarily in the community, even though there's local branches. And then also community foundations are really dynamic because not only does the giving stay local, the granting also does as well. So that's just one of the many wonderful reasons why community foundations exist. I think this year we've all gotten to see the Community Foundation in different ways through disaster funding, which is what Jason had highlighted, with being a convener and a grant funder and being able to attract local donors and national donors to our community. So each year, the foundation awards between 2.5 to 5 million per year. Within the first 3 months of this year, we awarded 2.5 million, which is really a credit to our generous donors in our community who saw the need and wanted to give, whether it was disaster related or to their favorite nonprofit who might not necessarily be doing disaster-like things, but was really impacted by the pandemic. So I'm really proud of the work that our donors and nonprofits have done during this time. So again, the role of the Community Foundation, we work in collaboration and do a lot of really wonderful, innovative programming. We partner with our donor advised funds, which I'll get into in just a little bit. And then we also do a lot of collaboration. So I had mentioned the Disaster Support Fund a little bit earlier. As part of this collaboration, we collaborated with local funders, local private funders, as in private foundations, but then we're also able to reach funders in the state and nationally to draw funding to our community to help us during this difficult time. One was the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and another one was Grantmakers Concerned with Immigrants and Refugees to support needs in our community. And now I just wanted to quick go over donor advised funds. So one of the things that I like to do when I give these presentations is I really want to give you as much insight to the Community Foundation as possible. So that way it's not just the application, but you can see all of the moving parts that happen. So when you submit a grant application, it's reviewed by a committee of volunteers. Some of those volunteers are board members, past board members, and they could also be your neighbor. We also like to incorporate nonprofit leaders in our decision-making processes as well. What doesn't get funded, or sometimes what partially gets funded, we forward on to our donor advised funds. So donor advised funds are funds that are held at the foundation that are similar to a charitable checking account. So pretend I'm a donor, I walk in, I give my funding to the Community Foundation, I get an instant tax deduction the year that I make that gift, but over the course of time, I can make grants to different organizations. So while I gave the foundation a gift to begin with, I might not have known who I wanted that funding to go to. And I may have, as a donor advisor, shown interest in youth or an environment or something like that. So when you submit a grant application to the foundation, it's twofold. It helps us to be able to grant out the money that we have through our competitive grant funds, but then we also use that to educate donors in the community that hold funds with us about different things that are happening. And sometimes some of those grant funds get partially funded or declined by us, but then get funded through a donor advised fund. And some of you might have received a grant through a donor advised fund, and it was a surprise, a nice surprise to get in the mail. There wasn't an application or anything like that. It just kind of happens. And so that's how those things connect. So now more specifically, I just wanted to give a quick brief overview of the 4 different grant programs that are available this grant cycle. So we have our health and wellness grants that are specific to San Luis Obispo County. We also have 2 build grant programs, and this is absolutely huge. So in the past, we've offered a grant program for organizations that have a budget of $500,000 or less. And this is really great strategic funding. It helps with capacity building or infrastructure. And some of the ways that I've seen this utilized in the past are strategic plans or different things like that. One of the things that I did over the fall and in the summer was talk to nonprofit leaders about what grant was the most impactful for them. And I heard over and over and over again that the grant that had the most impact for our nonprofits was our Build Grant program. And so what we did is we had a special allocation of grant funding from our board, and the remainder of that funding is going to support an additional Build Grant program that will support larger organizations. So our board special allocation was because of the pandemic, and so those funds will be exhausted this fall. So we won't be able to offer another Build Grant program for larger organizations in the near future. So it makes it kind of a unique funding opportunity. And then we also have our senior dances that support seniors coming together and dancing. So that's a quick overview of all of these grant programs, and I'll be jumping into the details in just a moment. So the big question always is who can apply? So unless otherwise noted, all of the applications have to be submitted by organizations that serve San Luis Obispo County. So if your organization is located in Santa Barbara or Outlying County, you're still eligible for applying for grants. They just have to serve San Luis Obispo County residents. You must also have a tax-exempt 501c3 in order to apply. If you don't have that, there's a different way that you can apply. It can be through partnering with an organization that does have a 501c3, and we call these fiscal sponsorships. So essentially, if you're applying through that lens, what you've done is you've partnered with a 501c3. Essentially, you as the organization complete the application, but it's then issued by the 501c3 organization. Any grant funding that's received by this fiscal sponsorship is sent directly to the 501c3, and the 501c3 and the fiscally sponsored project work together to issue those funds. So the relationship still stays between the foundation and the 501c3. The different components of the fiscal sponsorship working with the 501c3 organizations handled outside of the foundation. If you are a 501c3 that has an organization or an informal group of folks that want to submit a grant and you want help navigating that relationship, feel free to contact me. I have a couple of resources that I can share with you to ensure that things are buttoned up and that everybody has a clear understanding of who's doing what. Okay, are there any questions before I keep going? All right, well, I will keep jabbing away. So the 2021 Health and Wellness Grant Program has historically been very closely aligned with data assessments that have happened throughout the county. And because of the pandemic, all of the data that we have on hand suddenly feels incredibly expired. And while we're going to be gearing up and doing different assessments, we know that the need in our community is great. And so all of the grant programs, except for senior dances that are offered this fall, apply for all of these grant programs as a program grant, but know that after you receive the grant, they'll be converted to general operating support. So for example, if I were applying for a health and wellness grant program for oral health, even though it might be specifically in my application that it's for outreach or for toothbrushes or something like that, at the end of the day, when we issue the grant, it is completely flexible funding to be able to support whatever the organization needs for that purpose. So we really try to make it a little bit easier for organizations to be nimble and flexible, because even though hopefully the worst of the pandemic is in the rearview mirror, we know that organizations are having to continually be flexible. And so that's something that we're looking for. Okay, any questions about the Health and Wellness Grant Program? Okay, so senior dances. So this is one of my favorite grant programs to talk about, and I want to share with you the inside scoop on this grant. So this was created by an individual who met the love of his life at a senior dance, which is just adorable. And so what he wanted to do is he wanted to create a fund that enables community members to get to know one another. And who knows, maybe one day we'll hear a story about another individual that met the love of their life at a senior dance. The fund is actually quite large, and so we don't have enough activities happening in our county to exhaust the grant funding. So it's open to any organization throughout the state who's hosting senior dances. The maximum grant award is $10,000. We normally advertise this grant round in the spring, but because of the pandemic, we only received one grant application. And so we're re-advertising it this year in hopes that more dances can happen throughout the county. Okay, so I should also mention that the grant funding is really only for music, because having that live music is really important. Okay. So the Build Grant Program, I talked about this quite a bit at the beginning. So again, this is a really wonderful infrastructure type grant opportunity. So this is a great opportunity for both organizations that have budgets over 500 or those that have it below. I want to be really clear that you're not in competition with each other for grant dollars. On the back end, we've carved out different pockets of funding. So they'll be reviewed by two completely different committees. You're not in competition with one another, but these are really great grants to help think strategically about what your organization needs. So over the course of the year, I've received phone calls from nonprofit leaders that have requested funds for a multitude of things. And I just kind of want to list off a couple of different ideas that could fall within the Build Grants program, but I don't want to say this in a formulaic way. I just want to offer a couple of ideas. So infrastructure, that could be anything from you need a ADA compliant ramp to get into your building. Like, that's infrastructure. It could also be our entire business had to convert to doing work remote or hybrid, and we need technology to be able to accomplish that better. Another example is your arts organization and you have an onerous ticketing process. We have funded in the past streamlined ways to have ticketing and CRM type things. One of the questions that I got over the course of the year from a lot of organizations was wanting to do DEI training and strategic planning. So if this is something that you're interested in having for your organization, that could be something that the Build Grant Program could fund as well. Really, what I think will set a grant application out from others is talking about the timeliness of the request, like the why now, other than if you're an organization over 501 that has an operating budget of that. It's just saying like, well, this is the only time it's available. Like beyond that, we want to know how is this timely for your organization? If you're doing strategic planning, why is it important to your board? What buy-in do you have to do that now? I think that's really helpful. And then I think also a different component that sometimes sets folks above others is talking about the strategy behind it and the timeliness and the strategy and why this very thing, how this is going to be able to leverage additional resources, build capacity for staff. So in the example of ticketing, it helped free up staff to not have to manually keep track of things. It all went in a system, so that way staff could spend their time doing other things. So those are the type of things that I think are helpful to think about with the Build Grant program. We were able to increase the grant amount from a normal of $5,000 to $10,000. That's something that we're going to be able to continue to do in the fall, but next year, if you're a smaller organization, it'll revert back to 5,000. Any questions about the build? Okay. So as promised, I hope that I've already included some tips to submit a successful application, but I'm hoping to give you quite a few more. So I'll go ahead and do that. So some of the advice that we've received from reviewers is at the beginning of most of the applications, it asks for a brief summary. So you have the narrative, which is quite long, and you kind of explain in more detail what it is that you're doing. But the brief summary is something that is a snapshot of what you're seeking to do. And it's used a couple of different ways. If you receive a grant from the foundation, we use your brief summary to load onto our website to boast about the good work that you're doing. So having that be really clear and concise is twofold. It helps us get the word out about what you're doing. Also, it helps the community and donors see the work that you're doing. So keeping that brief summary really brief and concise and clear is super helpful. For reviewers, when they're reviewing, this is something that shows up on their matrix. And so it works for them as a reminder of what the application was. So a good thing to keep, again, clear and concise. The narrative, you'd be surprised, but often the way that we learn about what the organization is seeking to do is not in the narrative, it's often in the budget. So it gets a little bit confusing as to what the organization's wanting to do. Sometimes we learn a little bit about the organization, but not how the funding would actually be mobilized. And as I had mentioned before, all of the grants, with the exception of senior dances, will be converted to general operating support. But in the application, it's really important to say how you plan on using the funds. So I know that that's a little bit strange to know that it will get converted to something else, but we want to have a good idea when we're reviewing what's happening. I know also that getting good data at this point is a little bit fuzzy because there's so many things changing. But if you have any data that you can include that maybe talks about the experience of your clients last year versus this year, anything like that, usage of services, anything like that will really help to shape our understanding of how the community is using those resources. Lastly, because we don't have an infinite resources at the foundation, it's really helpful for us to know if there's any collaboration that's happening, if our funding, if we fund it, if it leverages outside resources. Those things are not required for a grant application, and actually we seldom see them. But if that is something that you are currently doing, it's helpful to include that as well. And the budget, it's just helpful for us to be able to gather whether the funds are being used efficiently and responsibly. So for the most part, the committee members, when they're reviewing grants, they completely trust that whatever the nonprofit says something costs, it costs. If there's anything that you think might raise an eyebrow, please include that. You can include just like a little narrative after you submit your budget within the form saying like, why this? So for example, the cost of construction has gone up threefold. And so if someone wasn't keeping on track of the cost of construction and knowing that a piece of lumber is so expensive now, it might raise an eyebrow. So if there's anything that like the average person might have questions about, it might be helpful to add a couple words around that, just because you don't want those kind of question marks to be the thing that would prevent you from getting funded. Okay, so tips for a successful application. So the applicant's cuttable. So how does one do this? So if you've received a grant through the Community Foundation before, all of our grant reviewers are given a grant history. So they'll see all of the different grants that you applied to. I also provide them with background. So if you receive a grant from the Community Foundation, you have to submit this thing called a grant report at the end, talking about what went well, what didn't go well. I read those, and any information that I glean about the organization, I'll be sharing with the committee members. If you're an organization that hasn't received a grant from the foundation, that doesn't preclude you from receiving future grants. So one of the things that I would do with establishing credibility is talk about why your organization is uniquely positioned to do the work that you're proposing. I would talk a little bit about the impact that you've had in the community to date. If you're a newer organization, you don't have to, but you're more than welcome to give me a call and we can talk about your proposal together. Again, want to be a thought partner to you, and I want you to be successful. And so feel free to lean on that as well. Adaptability and ability to be collaborative. So with our health and wellness grants, this is the area that I saw last year. A lot of programs really had to shift. And so you could have had an in-house program where all of a sudden the program closed and staffing had to change because you had people that were janitors or different things like that that were working in buildings that were no longer needed for that purpose. Showing how leadership adapted, how the staff moved to something else is something that I think our committee members find to be really interesting. So if you've adapted or done something differently because of the pandemic, or because who you've served over the course of the year has changed, that's really helpful to include. Again, collaboration is not a requirement for grant funding, but is something that we like to see. Lastly, is the problem significant? And this is really goes down to case making. So you can use data to talk about why the problem is significant, and data doesn't necessarily mean a report. It could mean your clients are saying this is the most important need in the community, or those that you serve think this, or your board has identified this as a key area of concern and you want to move from X to Y. So different things like that. Again, there's some elements of what it takes to have a good application. Number one is always well-defined. I think probably 1 in 5 applications we're a little confused as to what's happening until we read the budget. So be really clear about what you're seeking to do and how you're going to do it. And then also, if you do it, how will you know it was successful? Those are the different things that we'll be looking for. We'll also be curious to know if there's an unmet need. So hopefully we'll see this in your budget as far as budgeting unmet need, but also thinking about like where are the gaps in services in the community and how is your proposal seeking to serve that gap. Broad reach. So I would say that broad reach kind of has a tension with impact for a small group of people. So we hold both up to equal importance. So yes, we want a lot of people to be served by this proposal, but then we also understand the value of a proposal serving a smaller group of people, but having a very deep impact. So whichever type you might be falling between, normally organizations fall between one of the two. I would just do case making as to why that is and how it's important and how your strategy is developed to address and work in that manner. Also, scope. So one of the things that we're looking at is it feasible to get what you say done with the grant funding from us and within the larger budget? If it seems like what you're wanting to do is a little too ambitious for the grant funding, that's something that the committee will think about. And we'll also want to make sure that like it's manageable, that the staffing's in place to be able to see that through if you get funding. Reasonable, grounded in reality. Again, this is an area where data can really help with case making. The foundation really prides itself in being a data-centered decision maker. So any data that you can provide us, whether it's data that we have on our website or different data that you have from the clients you serve, that will help with case making. And then also that you have the skill and expertise to carry out whatever it is that you're seeking to do. Long ago, I received a great application from a youth serving organization that wanted to do youth mentorship, but they didn't talk about the staffing and how they were scaling up to be able to add that as a new program. And so it added a point of concern for the committee. So just kind of thinking through that lens. The last thing that I want to share with you, and I mentioned this at the beginning, was who reviews your applications. So your applications, as I mentioned before, are reviewed by community members. So they might not be technical experts in the environment or different components like that, but they are experts in the community. They understand Sloat County. So when writing your proposal, I would strip out any technical jargon, abbreviations, anything that would make a layperson have to go to Google and try and figure out what it is that you're talking about. The tone of your application would kind of be like you have a few friends over for dinner and you're talking about the great work of your organization. That kind of approachability, being able to be clear about what you're seeking to do, and that enthusiasm for what you do will shine through to our reviewers. I will say that after you submit your application, whether you receive funding or decline funding, you can email me, and I'm happy to share with you any feedback that I might have from the community evaluators. Sometimes I have really great feedback and other times I have less great feedback, but that's something that you can always ask about as well. Okay, before I jump into the more technical side of applying for grants on our website, are there any questions about any of the things that I've shared so far? Becca.
Hey, on the health and wellness grants, online, it says that it supports food and shelter, basic needs. Is that accurate?
It does, and it has a broader sense of what it supports too. It also supports more health prevention as well. So it's a very broad at this point to support the community needs. So it really goes down to, if you're applying for that grant, to be specific about what it is that you're seeking to do and how it's addressing a huge need in our community.
And if it's a basic thing, you know, like food, does it need to tie to health directly?
I think that you can do some case making around that. That would make it stronger.
Great, thank you. Of
course, thank you. Any other questions?
Hi, this is Stacy Hansen. I'm not sure if you went into this or not, but if we have several needs, are we allowed to apply for the health and wellness and the build grant, a build grant, or is it only we can only choose one grant to apply for?
Great question. You can choose multiple grants to apply to. You just can't apply to the same grant twice. So no 2 applications to health and wellness, but you can apply it to health and wellness and build.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Yeah, great question. Any other questions? Okay.
This is Melissa Wickman. I just had a question regarding the grant period. So once the grant is funded, what is the grant period?
Okay, so that's another great question. So the period is a year and a month from when it's awarded. So the grant decisions will be sent out on December 15th. So you'll have a year to expend the grants. And then there's another month that's added. So that way you have time to do the grant report, because we want the funds to be exhausted by the time you submit a grant report. One of the things that I'll add to that is everything is really fluid still in the world. So if for some reason something happens and you can't submit it in time, feel free to reach out to me and request a grant extension. And Sally, do you have a question?
Hi, yes, Sally Rogo with Capslo. Women's Legacy Fund and Opportunity to Thrive Fund, they're not being offered right now?
No, they were offered earlier this year and the funding decisions have already happened for them, but they'll be available in 2022.
Okay, thank you.
Great question. Great. Anything else before I talk about how to access and apply? Okay, so when you go onto our website, this is a snapshot of our home screen. All you have to do is click this nonprofit button. And when you do that, you'll go ahead and select to apply for and create an account. So if you've already created an account through the foundation, you just put in your email and your password and you're good to go. If for some reason you forgot your password, click forgot password. If there has been turnover at your organization and you don't have access to the previous person who had access to the online application, send me an email. There's a couple of technical things I can do to make those grant applications accessible to you. Okay. So one of the new things that is really great is that if you've submitted an application to us before, or if you're submitting multiple applications to the foundation, you now have a couple of options at your disposal. You can add a collaborator. So if you're working on something with your grant writer and your executive director, the two of you can have access to work on the application at the same time, or someone in finance. You can preview the application and have all of the questions in one place. If you're like me, I like to pull the questions, write it in Word, proof it, look over it, and then copy and paste it into the application. You also have the ability, once you get started, to import responses from existing applications. So if you've submitted an application to us before, what you had to do every single time is write in your organization, what year you started, who's the contact, and all of that, and it's really repetitive. Now we have this quick and easy button. You select that and it imports your information over. If you've submitted an application in the past and you want to submit a similar application, you can actually forward all of those questions, if the questions for the application that you're applying to haven't changed, into the new application that you're working on. So hopefully that will streamline things and make the application process a little bit faster for you. You'll also see the different dynamics of the application as well. So there's the applicant information. This is a really easy one to populate over if you've submitted before. The narrative, required attachments, and the terms and conditions statement. So all of these have to be completed before you can submit. One of the things to watch out for is it's not submitted until you push submit. So every single year we have someone that goes through and completes everything but doesn't actually submit, and that means that we don't actually see it. So make sure that you submit. You should also be receiving an auto response email from our office saying thank you for submitting. If you don't receive that confirmation email, please call me or send me an email, because that might mean that we haven't received it. Again, all of the applications have required attachments. We request a project budget proposal. We have a template that can be helpful. You don't have to use it if you have something else that is easier for you, but we've learned that having a couple of directions around that can be helpful. We also want to see your 2021 abbreviated organizational budget. This is especially important if you're applying for the Build Grant program, because you're eligible for one of the two. And then we want to see a list of major and current resources of funding. This is probably the question that I get the most when it comes to budget things, is how detailed does that need to be? And how much donor information do I need to share? And you don't have to share it at the extreme detail level. You can share it more at the forest level of, you know, this is how much it comes from private foundations, this is individual donations, this could be something else. So it can be at a higher level. Again, when you get into the application, you can see the list of all of the applications you've started. So right now it looks like I just started applying for one grant, but if I was applying for multiple grants, I could see a snapshot of them all right here. And then I can also verify the status. So if I push the submit button, if I hadn't gotten the email and was curious, I could look here and see what the status was of it. And then I can also wait a couple minutes and receive that email if I wanted to. And then I can also see who's attached to that application. If you've submitted grants in the past, you can access them through this toggle. says active, you can click down and you can see inactive applications too. So important dates to keep in mind is the deadline for this grant round is October 1st at 5 p.m. The application closes right at 5. So it will shut down. So if you haven't submitted, you won't be able to push submit at 5:01. It just shuts down. So I would give yourself a little bit of wiggle room. Hopefully you'll submit early, but if you're like most of us, it might actually come in on October 1st, and there's no crime in that. Just make sure to submit it at least 15 minutes early to make sure that it all goes through. We will be doing award notification on December 15th, and so that's when you'll hear whether or not you received the award. The online application will also be updated with award decisions as soon as they're made. So you might see the decision in the online application fairly quickly too. So it's another way of being able to see that. Before I jump into that, are there any questions about anything that I've shared before I jump into next year's grants calendar? Okay. So for the 2022 grants calendar, we're going to fall into more of a normal cadence for the foundation. So I had shared that this year, because of the pandemic, organizations requested that we have funding available as soon as possible. So we pushed up the timeline for our grants. This year, we are going to have more of a streamlined process that won't be quite as rushed. So the Field of Interest grant programs, they will become available in middle of January and will be due March 2022. The Field of Interest grant program consists of Growing Together, which is a fund for LGBTQ community members, the Women's Legacy Fund, which supports the needs of women and girls, Janssen Foundation, which supports youth and with sports and allied things that are similar to sports for students or youth that don't necessarily participate in sports. So like music is the equivalent for a lot of youth that don't participate in sports, as well as our senior dances. So we'll be re-advertising the senior dances at that point. Our general grants program will become available over the summer. It will feature our build grants, and sorry to the organizations that have larger budgets, this is only for the organizations that have a budget of 500,000 and below. It'll also include our Opportunity to Thrive, health and wellness, and community needs. The decisions for both of these grants will typically take place 2 months after the deadline. We have an approval process here where our grants committee reviews the grants after our community members review them, and then they're finalized by the board. So that's kind of the process that happens after you submit your application. It goes through 3 different rounds of approval before it's finalized. So any questions?
I'll do another, Cassandra. What do you anticipate the funding year to be on the general grant program? Like, do you think those will be awarded for like January through December 2023?
So are you asking about the grant timeline of how?
So if one applies for the general grant program, which closes in August, right? Next year?
Yes.
Then will that funding be like January through December of 2023?
It should be October through November. So okay. It's the month that the decision gets made, it's a year and a month from that date.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, great question. And Sally, I can't tell if it's a new question or the same question. There's a hand up and I just want to make sure I don't pass you. Looks like it went down. Okay, any other questions? Well, great. Well, I really appreciate your time, and please don't be a stranger if anything pops up for you. Please feel free to send me an email. It's the quickest way to get a hold of me right now because of the hybrid work environment. And I just want to give you all a heartfelt thank you. This has been a difficult year, and you all have done incredible work. during the course of the year to serve the clients or the communities that you work in. And I am so appreciative of the work that you're doing. And if you need to chat about anything, please feel free to reach out and don't be a stranger. So thank you all.